Hello, my name is Shane. Welcome to All That Work for Nothing. So I've been thinking about doing more of these like kind of off the cuff kind of videos, usually as a follow-up to the episode we just released. So like I said in the previous video, I've loved history and loved the Civil War since I was in third grade. When I went to see a reenactment at the Richard Nixon Library, which it's very weird saying all those words out loud at once. This was not my first time at the Richard Nixon Library, actually. This was. Yes, that's right. My mom took me and my sister to stare at a casket, I guess. But ever since that day, anything about the Civil War, I was obsessed. I needed it all. I watched Ken Burns' Civil War probably like 10 times all the way through. Like, I'm not even joking. Like, that was like my thing when I was like in middle school, which made me very popular, as you can probably guess. Now, here's another photo. Yeah, just like any other normal 11-year-old. I went as Ulysses S. Grant for Halloween. So yeah, that should give you kind of an idea of me growing up as a kid. I think I loved like how they were like steampunk cowboy soldiers, which obviously a couple years later when Wild Wild West came out, me and my cousin were front row center. Absolutely loved that movie. Had a total blast. And then as soon as it was done, I went straight to Burger King to get the Will Smith sunglasses. I had those pair probably until college. So, yeah, obviously when I was in college and I heard the story about the Oberlin Rescuers, I was all about it. That story stuck with me, and that's why we made the episode. So this video is going to be kind of just some things I didn't get a chance to cover, things I wanted to talk about a little bit more. I think Extra Credits or Extra History does a video like this, and I always really like when they do these follow-up videos. I think they call them History Lies, so this is what we're doing right now. So like one of the first things I want to talk about that I didn't get a chance to that kind of jumped off the page to me when I was rereading the chapter about the Oberlin Rescuers was just how political everything was. People always like complain about how political everything is today. Everything is political. Well, it was true back then, and it's probably not the best sign that things were as political as they are now right before the Civil War. But it really was true. So like when John Scott and his men came in through the back door of the Wadsworth Hotel, one of his men actually yelled out, "First Democrat that keeps us from going upstairs, I will shoot." And then he did. He tried to shoot somebody, and John Scott knocked his arm out of the way, and the bullet went up into the rafters. That little fucker Shakespeare. He was like him and his dad were like those conservatives that live in California and complain about how hard they are. Like they're a persecuted group of people because they're the only assholes in town. Well, that was why Shakespeare helped out the slave catchers, is because like my daddy was a Democrat, so I knew we were going to help. He's a piece of Shakespeare.
Well, since my pa was a good Democrat, the slave catchers had been advised to ask him for help capturing John Price and his friend Frank. But my pa wasn't home at the time, and when they found out that I was planning to go to Oberlin the next day, they asked me for help instead. Offered me $20 if I could get both John Price and his friend Frank into a buggy with me and bring them to Oberlin.
That grand jury was all Democrats. When I said like pro-slavery grand jury, I meant straight Democrats. That's exactly who they found out. The marshal who helped out, Democrat. Everybody who got charged, all Republicans. The guy who helped them out at the jail, the sympathetic sheriff, Republican. And that was everything back then. Like there was like divest campaigns against the South. There was boycotts against Southern cotton. There was like everything was viewed through a political lens by the time the Republican Party formed in 1856. If you were a normal person who thought slavery was awful, you were probably a Republican. And if you were a piece of shit, you were probably a Democrat back then. And then, of course, there was like the middle ground. There was like these Democrats who like tried to like act like they didn't like slavery, but like did everything to help it. And then there was like shit libs back then were Republicans. Interestingly enough, one of the worst shit libs back then was Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln actually did not like the rescuers. He actually said that they broke the law and law and order. Like he was running a Senate campaign at the time, so he kind of had to, he couldn't be too radical because Illinois was a tough state and he was running against like the biggest politician. Stephen Douglas was like the biggest politician. So he kind of had to strike this middle ground. But if like us normal people were like back then, and Abraham Lincoln was our nominee in 1860, we would have been upset. Like if you like were a Bernie person in 2020, take that feeling you felt about Joe Biden, that would have been on Abraham Lincoln. So that just goes to show you like how much the war really changed him as a person, and kind of like how history is almost like rewritten his whole story. But you gotta go back. You gotta dig in and kind of like try to get into like the moment. That's the good stuff. Another thing I want to talk about is that one of the accused was a guy named Charles Langston. And Charles Langston had a like really cool brother in town. He wasn't charged because he wasn't in Wellington that day. Charles Langston did go to Wellington, and so that's why he got charged. He gave this amazing speech. He rocked the whole audience. He like captivated the day. It's kind of one of the only, like, when you tell the rescuer story, that's usually always attached to it. We just didn't have time in this episode. But the cool thing about Charles Langston was that his grandson eventually becomes Charles Langston Hughes, who's an amazing American socialist. We're going to link down below Charles Langston's awesome speech, and then we're also going to list a video of Charles Langston Hughes when he was up in front of the McCarthy jury, the Committee on Un-American Activities. It's really great. It kind of talks a lot about his history and how he gets his perspective and his worldview, and yeah, click it down below. The other thing I want to talk about, another chapter in here. Once you read the Jefferson Davis herpes chapter, because obviously after the Oberlin Rescuers, that should be your next read in 1858. But one of the more interesting ones was about that motherfucker James Buchanan. James Buchanan is probably the worst. It's either him or Andrew Johnson. Like they swap places on who's the actual worst. Because James Buchanan was really fucking stupid.
Time for a big decision, James. Do not screw this up. Return all the escaped slaves! Send them home! Nailed it.
James Buchanan really thought he was smart and really thought he could tinker and just work things out and make them just the way he wanted them to, because he was like one of the most experienced people to ever be elected president. But the more he tried to fix things, the worse it got. And one example was from the Dred Scott case. So before he was even president, before he was even sworn in, he actually meddled in the Dred Scott case because it was clear that the case was going to be against Scott. There was like 5 Southern Democrat justices. So like the same way we kind of feel now, where it's like we would need a miracle sometimes to win certain cases. That same feeling back then. So before he was even president, he wrote a letter to one of the justices who he had gone to school with, and they were from the same state. That guy's name was Robert Grier. And he wrote Grier because they also had another friend that was on the court, and they kind of schemed out a way to make it seem like it wouldn't be as close. Because if it was a 5-4 decision, then it's still controversial. But if it was like a 6-3, 7-2 decision, then he thought, oh, that would mean that everyone's just going to forget about slavery. They're just going to be like, oh, well, it's a done deal. No need to worry about it here. Also, he didn't want it just to be a Southern versus Northern sort of decision, because then people would start to say it's a slave conspiracy. So he pressures Grier into siding against Scott. And then another justice who was kind of on the fence eventually sides against Scott as well. And that makes a decision 7-2. Now, you are not supposed to do this. It was supposed to come out before he got inaugurated, but the decision ends up coming out like right after he gets inaugurated. And obviously the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who's Roger Taney, he is swearing in Buchanan when they have a little whisper conversation. They have a little talk, and some people have speculated that that was Taney telling Buchanan that the decision was going to be 7-2 and that it was a done deal, because Buchanan puts in his inauguration speech, oh yeah, I'll totally be happy to side with whatever decision the Supreme Court may have made. There's not a lot of question that he was meddling. So yeah, so James Buchanan, just L after L, the worst. Easy 1A or 1-2 at the bottom of all presidents. And then the last thing I want to talk about is that really the motivation of this whole story, John Price, he doesn't have a side of the story. We never find anything John Price has written. We never get his perspective on the rescue. He escapes into Canada and then just disappears from history. So the person who kind of this story was all about, this person who the story was all centered around, we don't know his narrative. We don't know how he thought about this. It's kind of like been lost to history. So all the information about John Price is from all the people around him, all the people who were either trying to free him or the people who were trying to bring him back to slavery. We never really know his perspective. And that's kind of the tragedy of this thing, is that the central character, his story is never probably going to be discovered. So those are just some things I wanted to follow up on, like discuss a little bit more. The mission of this channel really is that history is a great place where we can find common ground. History is a great place where we can get some people a little bit more radicalized, and we can get other people a little bit more knowledgeable, and we can get their sort of understanding of the world a little bit more richer. Thank you all for watching. If you have any other topics, subjects you want us to cover, leave them down below. Other than that, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, follow us on all the socials, and don't forget, the future is ahead of us.